The market was already alive by the time the first pink threads of dawn wove themselves into the sky, yet there was always one figure who seemed to arrive before even the earliest merchants, the girl with the bare feet and the ribbon in her hair. Lila carried no wares to sell, no cart to push, no animals to tend. What she brought instead was motion, the kind that caught a wandering gaze and refused to let it go. She danced in the open spaces between the produce stalls and the cloth merchants' tables, finding rhythm in the clatter of wooden wheels, the shouts of vendors hawking their goods, and the laughter of children darting between baskets of fruit. Her clothes were worn, patched so many times that the original fabric was a mystery, but she wore them with the same ease she carried her own skin. The scarf tied around her hair had once been crimson, now faded into a soft rust, and it fluttered like a banner with each turn of her head. The leather strap across her shoulder held nothing more than a pouch of coins, meager, uneven earnings from the previous day's dance. Yet her eyes sparkled as if the world itself had handed her a fortune. Lila's life had been shaped by narrow streets and small mercies. She had been born in one of the poorest quarters of the market town, a place where the roofs leaned tiredly over crooked alleys and doors were patched with whatever scrap wood could be found. Her father had been a cooper, bending strips of oak into barrels for the wine merchants, but he'd passed when she was only 6, leaving her mother to work as a washerwoman. By 10, Lila had taken to the market to earn extra coins, at first sweeping stalls for a copper or two, later discovering she could gather more from curious eyes if she simply moved her body to the music in her head. The dance came naturally, nobody had taught her. She claimed it was something the wind whispered to her feet and the earth hummed into her bones. She danced not for applause, not even for the coins people tossed, but because she couldn't bear the thought of walking through life without turning each step into something more than survival. It was her way of carving joy into a world that too often pressed people flat. On busy mornings, the market's air was thick with spice, cumin and cinnamon, tangy with citrus peel, warm with the yeasty promise of fresh bread. As people bargained and called out, Lila's steps threaded through the sounds. She had a knack for catching moments when the sunlight struck the cobblestones just right, casting her shadow long and sharp, and she'd spin so her skirt flared wide, making the children giggle. Some of the vendors liked her presence, swearing she brought more customers to their stalls. Others grumbled that she distracted buyers and got in the way. But even the grumblers paused now and then, caught by the strange alchemy of her movement, how a girl in patched clothes could command the air around her as if it were a stage built for royalty. When she danced, she forgot she was poor. She forgot the small room she shared with her mother, the cracked window that let in the cold, the endless tally of unpaid debts. In those moments there was only the rhythm, her own heartbeat answering the market's pulse. She would sway, then twist, bending low to the ground before springing upright, her hands cutting arcs through the air. It was a style nobody could name. It was part village folk steps, part acrobatics she'd taught herself watching tumblers at seasonal fairs, and part something entirely her own. Children loved her best. They'd gather at her ankles, imitating her turns and jumps, their little feet slapping the cobblestones. She would slow her dance to lift one of them high or take their hands so they could feel what it was to move in time with something unseen. The grown-ups might mutter about her being idle, but the children understood. They didn't need to be told that joy was worth more than bread for a few moments each day. Despite her warmth with strangers, Lila's life was not easy. At night, she returned home exhausted, her earnings barely enough to buy supper, a loaf of bread, a small wedge of cheese, perhaps a handful of dried figs if the day had been good. Her mother often scolded her for not finding real work, something steady, but Lila would smile, place the coins in her mother's palm and say, "People pay me for what I can give them. That is as real as it gets." Her mother would sigh but never press further. Deep down, she knew the girl's spirit was not one that could be caged. Rumors about her had begun to drift through the market like smoke, some harmless, some tinged with envy. There were those who claimed she had charms sewn into her scarf, that her grace came from magic. Others whispered she'd been born under a lucky star, though luck seemed a strange word for a girl who owned so little. Still, the mystery added to her allure, and someday she'd find herself surrounded by travelers who'd heard of the dancing girl of the marketplace, and wanted to see if the stories were true. She learned to play to these moments, to tilt her chin just so, to hold a final pose until the crowd's applause or coin-throwing reached its peak. Her mother said she was clever, but Lila didn't think of it as cleverness. It was simply reading the room the way a fisherman reads the water, knowing when to cast the net. And yet, behind the beauty of her dancing, there was an undercurrent of something deeper. She danced not just for joy, but to resist the weight of the life she'd been given. Every twirl, every leap, was a declaration that she was more than her circumstances, that the narrow lanes of her childhood could not contain her entirely. She imagined, sometimes, that the ground beneath the market opened into a road only she could see, leading to places far beyond the reach of gossiping vendors and cracked doorways. The market loved her in its own uneven way. It gave her a stage, it fed her in scraps, it clothed her in its discarded cloth. But it also harbored those who resented her light. People who could not understand why a poor girl should be admired simply for moving her feet. There were women who scowled when their husbands lingered to watch her spin, and men who mocked her when their pockets were too tight to toss her a coin. She had learned to keep her smile even then, knowing that dignity was as much a part of her performance as any step or turn. On this particular morning, the sun was strong and the market busier than she'd seen it all season. Merchants from distant villages had come with carts piled high, glossy dates, dyed fabrics, trinkets of hammered copper. Lila felt the energy in the air as soon as she stepped onto the cobblestones. The crowd's movement became her music, the jostle and shuffle like drumbeats in her blood. She leaped into the open space and began her dance, feeling the world narrow to the arc of her arms, the sway of her hips, the patter of her feet. A small group gathered quickly. Coins began to clink into the pouch at her hip. A baker's boy offered her the heel of a loaf, and she twirled with it before tossing it back to him, earning a burst of laughter. For a moment she thought, perhaps foolishly, that life was exactly as it should be. That the market and its people, with all their rough edges, had made room for her after all. She could not have guessed that this same space, this same morning, would soon turn from her stage into the place of her deepest humiliation, or that the path to a king's gaze would begin right here between the stalls. The day Lila danced beneath the high, clear sky, with the smell of fresh bread and spice thick in the air, there were more eyes on her than she could count. Some were kind, alight with the easy joy of those who came to the market to be entertained between errands. Others were calculating, watchful in a way that didn't match the smiles on their faces. Among these watchers were the people who had once been the brightest sparks in the square, performers who had claimed the cobblestones as their own long before Lila had stepped into the open space with her bare feet and rust-colored scarf. To them, her arrival in the marketplace had been an irritation at first, the kind of novelty that would fade once the townsfolk grew tired of her steps. But the novelty hadn't faded. In fact, the more she danced, the more people seemed to gather. Where their songs and tricks once drew steady crowds, now fewer and fewer coins landed in their baskets. It was one thing to compete with each other. There had always been rivalries between the jugglers, the puppet masters, the flute players, but Lila was different. She brought something they could not imitate, something that made their skills look suddenly stale. Some of them tried to match her. A pair of singers took to learning new harmonies, hoping to lure her audience away with sweetness of voice. The fire breather added riskier stunts to his performance, holding the flames in his mouth for longer, forcing gasps from his dwindling audience. But when Lila danced nearby, it was as if all the sound and heat in the square shifted toward her. At first, the murmurs were little things. "She must have a charm sewn in her skirt," one performer would say to another. "How else could she draw so many?" Or, "It's pity they're giving her coins for, look at her clothes, it's charity disguised as applause." But murmurs are like sparks in a dry field, they catch quickly. Within weeks, the rumors began to sharpen. They whispered that she was sly, that she deliberately moved closer to other performers' spots to steal their audiences. They said she used her looks, though Lila herself thought her face plain except when lit by movement, to distract men from watching the jugglers or the storytellers. A few claimed she had once been caught cheating a vendor, paying with false coins, though no one could name the vendor or the day. The lack of proof mattered little. Gossip needs no roots to grow. It became a game to see who could plant the most cutting remark without being caught. One flute player muttered, just loud enough for a few nearby shoppers to hear, that girls who danced in the streets often danced in private for richer patrons. Another performer, a storyteller with a fine booming voice, joked that Lila would be better off selling herself as a ribbon to tie around a man's arm than spinning in the dust. Such words did not reach her directly most days, but she could feel their weight in the shifting air around her. People looked at her differently, not with the pure warmth they once had, but with curiosity tinged by doubt. Still she danced. To stop would be to admit defeat, and she could not let herself be bent by words. Yet she noticed changes. A small boy who once clapped eagerly now held tight to his mother's skirt when she passed, his eyes uncertain. A wealthy woman who had once tossed her a silver coin turned away without meeting her gaze. These were tiny slights, but Lila felt each one as surely as she felt the blisters on her feet at the end of a long day. The rival performers began to gather in their own corners of the market after she had gone home, their voices low and conspiratorial. They complained about the unfairness of it all. "She gives nothing to the market," they said, ignoring the fact that none of them gave more than their own performances. "She takes and takes. And the more she takes, the less we have." A plan began to take shape among them, not all at once, but in fragments that wove together like threads on a loom. Some suggested crowding her space with their own acts so that no one could see her clearly. Others thought of convincing the market wardens to forbid her from performing without a license, knowing she could not afford the fee. And then, from one voice, half serious at first, came a suggestion darker than the rest. Perhaps she needed to be taught a lesson she would not forget. Resentment is a strange thing. It can make cruel ideas sound like justice. Soon they were imagining humiliations, small punishments that would break her spirit or drive her away. None of them admitted aloud how much of their anger came not from lost coins but from the fact that her joy was effortless, and theirs felt, lately, like labor. By the time the sun dipped low one evening and the market stalls began to close, the whispers had already shifted from words into intent. Lila danced on, unaware that behind the music of the square, another rhythm was building, a rhythm of quiet plodding, each beat timed to the steps of envy. The market was at its fullest that day, a sea of color and motion. The sun caught on copper pots and glass beads, on ribbons fluttering from stall awnings. The air was thick with smells, fried dough, spiced meat, orange peel crushed underfoot. Lila felt alive in that hum of life, her body moving without thought to the rhythms of the musicians nearby. She spun on the worn stones, skirt flaring, bare feet finding the familiar heat of the earth beneath them. The crowd had gathered as it always did, a circle of faces leaning in to watch, some swaying gently in time to the music. The coins in her little basket already gleamed under the sun. But beyond the first ring of smiling onlookers, there were other eyes, sharp, unblinking, not softened by music. The rivals were there, pretending to be part of the audience, their hands busy with cups and wares from nearby food vendors. One of them, a stocky man known for balancing flaming sticks, stood closer than usual, holding a small brass pot with a rag draped over it. To any passerby he might have looked like he was carrying soup from a stall. The moment came during one of her turns. She stepped forward, toes pressing against the edge of the circle, skirt brushing the hem of a child's tunic. The man shifted suddenly, stumbling just enough to sell the illusion, and the brass pot tipped. A shining wave of liquid arced through the air and splattered against the stones. Some of it struck the ground. The rest landed squarely across Lila's feet. It was hot, so hot that for a breath her mind couldn't name it, only registered the instant, blinding shock. Then came the pain, searing and sharp, cutting up through her calves as if the stones themselves had turned molten. She gasped, the sound swallowed by the crowd's collective murmur. Her next step faltered, her knee bent without permission. The music stumbled too, the players uncertain whether to stop. But before the silence could settle, voices cut through, half laughs, half jeers. "Careful, dancer. The market's not a place for clumsy feet. Too hot for you? Maybe you should keep your shoes on." They sounded like jokes to anyone who didn't see her skin reddening, the blisters already beginning to rise. The smell of hot oil mixed now with the scent of cooked flesh, faint but undeniable to those nearest her. She could feel the slick burn coating her skin, each heartbeat pressing the pain deeper. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she did not fall. That was the thing, they might have taken her skin, her comfort, but they would not take her stance. She shifted her weight onto the edges of her feet, forcing herself upright. She could see in the eyes of a few in the crowd that they understood, an older woman with a basket, a boy who looked away quickly, but no one moved to help. The man with the brass pot stammered something about being sorry, though his eyes didn't match his voice. He knelt to retrieve the pot, his lips curving in a way that looked almost like satisfaction before he turned away. The music started again, hesitant, as if to smooth over the interruption. A few clapped, trying to coax her to move. And though every nerve in her feet screamed, Lila lifted her arms once more. She would not give them the show of her retreat. But in the space between beats, she understood something. This was no accident. The stares, the tight smiles, the timing of the stumble, it was deliberate, born of the same envy she had felt curling around her in whispers. And in their act, they had given her something strange and sharp, not unlike the pain itself, a reason to burn brighter than the oil ever could. The first shock was like a hammer blow, so sudden her vision went white at the edges, her body instinctively screaming to fold inward to shield itself. Her knees trembled, and she could feel the weight of her own body pressing toward the ground. The oil clung to her skin, a wet, glistening layer of agony that made every nerve flare red-hot. It would have been so easy, so merciful, to sink down right there on the sun-baked stones, to cradle her feet and cry. And for a heartbeat she nearly did. Her breath came shallow, ragged, and she could hear her pulse thudding inside her ears like a drum. The market sounds blurred together into a dull roar, voices, footsteps, the lazy flutter of a banner overhead. But beneath it all was the thin thread of laughter, barely audible, just enough to reach her through the haze. That was what caught her. The laughter wasn't kind. It wasn't the awkward chuckle of strangers embarrassed for her. It was the sly, sharp-edged sort that thrived on watching someone falter. The same tone she had heard in market corners when other dancers failed mid-performance, when a juggler dropped all his pins, when a singer cracked on a high note. It was the voice of people who wanted her smaller, quieter, gone. She straightened. It wasn't sudden like a defiant shout. It was slow, deliberate, a careful shift of her shoulders back, a deep inhale that steadied her enough to lift her chin. Her arms, which had hung limp for that one vulnerable moment, rose again into position. Her mind began to split the pain into pieces, the way she might break a complicated rhythm into smaller beats. She couldn't stop the burn, but she could give it shape. Every step she took would not be the collapse they wanted, it would be something she gave them on her own terms. The musicians were watching her now, uncertain if they should continue. She met their eyes for just an instant, a silent command hidden in the lift of her brow. Play. They obeyed. The drumbeat returned, low and steady. The stringed instrument plucked a quick melody, the notes bouncing like droplets on stone. And Lila moved. Her first steps were cautious, the balls of her feet touching down with care, the oil still wet against her skin. But as the rhythm grew, she began to fold the pain into the motion. Her turns were tighter, her spins faster, her arms slicing the air with precision. The ache became a kind of fire that filled her chest and surged down her limbs, each movement sharper than before. Gasps replaced laughter in the crowd. It was not the graceful, airy dance she had started with, it was fiercer, every step weighted with intention. Even those who didn't understand the reason for the change could feel the difference. Something in her movements spoke of endurance, of refusal. The rivals stood near the back now, their smirks gone. They had expected her to limp away, to end her performance in humiliation. Instead, the market was leaning in closer, pulled by a current they didn't fully understand. She spun again, hair brushing her cheek, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, not on her enemies but on something further, higher. The world seemed to narrow to the space inside her chest, where pain and pride twisted together until they were indistinguishable. She knew, as her breath began to quicken and her vision cleared, that this choice, this refusal to collapse, would not be forgotten, at least not by those who had seen it. And that was enough for now. The music no longer felt like something outside of her. It pulsed through her skin and bone, mingling with the burn in her feet until the two sensations were impossible to separate. The fire on her skin had become the drum's heartbeat, a steady, relentless push that demanded movement. Every nerve screamed, but instead of letting it consume her, she shaped it into motion. Her feet landed harder, sharper. Where before her steps had been light and fluid, now they struck the stone with purpose, like sparks leaping from flint. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she bent low into a sweeping turn, the hem of her skirt flaring out like a burst of flame. Her arms carved deliberate arcs in the air, fingers slicing through the sunlight as though painting her defiance into it. She locked eyes with a merchant in the front row for a fleeting second, and his jaw slackened. He had seen her dance before, gentle, playful, with the easy charm of someone born to bring joy, but this was different. This was a storm contained in a single body. The musicians felt it too. The drummer's hands sped up without conscious thought, pushing the beat faster, each thud echoing in her chest. The string player's fingers danced along the frets, weaving quicksilver notes around her movements. The air in the market thickened. The smells of spiced bread and roasting meat faded to nothing under the weight of the performance. Her pain gave her movements an edge no training could have taught. When she spun, her skirt's swish carried an undercurrent of danger, as though each turn might slice the air itself. When she lifted her arms overhead, the tendons in her hands pulled tight, her fingertips trembling, not from weakness but from the strain of holding so much energy in such a small space. Her face, usually open and smiling, now held something else entirely. It was the look of someone who had been tested and refused to yield, and it struck the crowd silent. Somewhere at the edge of her awareness, she saw the jealous rivals shift uncomfortably. Their plan had been to humiliate her, to break her spirit in the most public way possible. Yet here she was, commanding more attention than she ever had before, her every move burning itself into the memory of those watching. She leapt, and for a heartbeat she was entirely off the ground, skirts and hair flaring around her like a halo of fire. The moment her feet struck the stone again, a hiss escaped her lips, not loud enough for the crowd to hear, but just enough to keep her rooted in the reality of her pain. The oil still clung to her, making every landing a reminder of what had been done to her. And yet, every sting became another beat in the rhythm, another reason to keep moving. As the song reached its middle, she began to change the shape of her dance. Her hips snapped to the rhythm with sudden, deliberate accents. Her arms curved in precise, looping gestures that drew invisible patterns in the air. She stamped her heels in time with the drum, the sound ringing out like a challenge. Children craned their necks from between the legs of taller onlookers. Old women with baskets of herbs stopped mid-step, their eyes fixed on her. Her expression deepened, eyes narrowing slightly, her lips parting just enough to reveal her quickened breaths. She was telling a story now, though no words were spoken. A story of being struck down and rising sharper than before, of finding strength in places meant to be broken. The crowd could feel it even if they couldn't name it. The air hummed with the pull of it. By the time the final stretch of the music began, the market had transformed. No one bartered. No one shouted over prices or haggled over weights. Every eye was on the girl in the center of the square, her bare, burned feet moving with impossible precision, her shadow flickering across the sunlit stones like the dancing flame she had become. When the last note fell, she did not collapse. She stood still, chest rising and falling, the skirt of her dress swaying from the momentum she'd just unleashed. The silence that followed was heavy, charged, almost reverent, until the first clap rang out. Then another. And another. Soon the applause was rolling over her like a wave. But even as the crowd roared, she didn't smile. The dance wasn't about joy anymore. It was about showing them, and herself, that she could take the worst they gave her and turn it into something they couldn't look away from. The king had not planned to stop in the market that day. His advisors had urged him to take the main road toward the border, where a meeting with a neighboring ruler awaited, but the early morning air had been clear and crisp, and he had decided, on a whim, that he would travel without the heavy escort and pomp that usually announced his presence. Dressed in a plain traveler's cloak, his signet ring turned inward on his finger, he moved through the stalls like any other merchant or nobleman's son, accompanied only by one trusted guard who blended easily into the crowd. He had always liked markets. They told truths palaces could not. The smell of ripe fruit or drying fish told him whether the harvest had been good. The pitch of the hawkers' voices revealed desperation or prosperity. The faces of the people told him more than any court report could. But that morning the air was strangely still, as though the market itself was holding its breath. He noticed it before he saw the cause: no clattering of coins, no cries of fresh figs. Best price today. Instead, every head in the square seemed turned toward one point near the old fountain. And then he heard it, the sharp, deliberate slap of bare feet against stone, followed by the rise and fall of music, quick and insistent. He moved closer, weaving between the frozen merchants and the captivated townsfolk until the crowd thinned enough for him to see her. The girl stood in the center of the square, skirts flaring with each spin, her movements both graceful and edged with something raw. She was not just dancing, she was fighting and yielding at the same time, bending and striking as though the music itself had teeth. It took him only a glance to notice the redness on her feet, the glistening sheen where hot oil had clearly scalded her skin. The king's eyes narrowed. He knew cruelty when he saw it. And yet, there she was, moving as though the pain was fuel, as though every step was an act of defiance carved into the stone beneath her. He forgot himself entirely in watching her. Her hands arced overhead, then swept down like wings slicing through wind. Her turns were sharp, sudden, then softened into slow, deliberate steps that drew the eye like a tide pulling at the shore. The fire in her expression was unmistakable, an unspoken story written in the tightening of her jaw, the flicker in her gaze, the way she seemed to dance for no one's approval but her own. The king's guard leaned closer, murmuring, "Your Majesty, we should," but he silenced him with a raised hand. "She is telling something," the king said quietly, his voice almost lost beneath the beat of the drum and the gasps of the crowd. "Do you hear it? The way the music bends to her, the way she is not following it but commanding it." The guard shifted uneasily, glancing at the girl again. "I see it, but I cannot name it." The king could name it. It was the mark of someone who had been wronged and refused to be erased. He had seen it before in soldiers who returned from war carrying scars like medals, in farmers who had rebuilt after flood or fire without waiting for aid. This girl's scars were fresh and bleeding, yet she was already turning them into something people could not look away from. As the dance grew faster, the king found himself leaning forward, drawn into the rhythm. It was not just beauty, though she was undeniably beautiful in the way sunlight and shadow played across her skin, it was the truth she was spilling onto the stones with every step. And truth, the king knew, was the rarest performance of all. He noticed the people around him stealing glances at one another, as if afraid to speak aloud what they were feeling. Even the vendors, who lived by constant chatter, were silent. An old woman next to him clutched the strings of her empty basket, eyes wide, lips parted as though in prayer. A child near the front reached out, tiny fingers twitching with the urge to join the dance, but his mother held him back, her gaze fixed on the girl as though she feared breaking the spell. And then the king's attention shifted for a heartbeat to a cluster of young women standing off to the side, their expressions twisted, not with admiration but with bitterness. He caught the whisper of their words, "She should have stopped. She should be crawling." Their envy was as sharp as the jealousy he'd seen at court. The king's jaw tightened. When the music swelled toward its final crescendo, the girl leapt, not high but far, her body cutting through the air before she landed hard enough to send a shiver up his spine. She ended in a stance so still it felt like the world had stopped to see it. The silence afterward was heavy and reverent, the kind of silence a king rarely heard outside of temples. The applause began slowly, but once it started, it rolled through the market like a breaking wave. The king's guard gave a quiet sigh. "It seems she has them." "She has more than them," the king replied. His gaze lingered on her bowed head, on the way her chest rose and fell as she caught her breath. "She has me." The girl didn't notice him, not yet. She was surrounded by strangers, praise and whispers, but she stood apart somehow, as though still in the fire she had just conjured. The king felt the pull to know her name, to understand the story behind her burned feet and unbroken spirit. He would not leave the market until he did. The crowd was still buzzing when the music faded and the drummers set down their instruments, their palms reddened from the unrelenting beat. The scent of sweat, hot bread from a nearby stall, and something faintly metallic, like the air before a summer storm, hung in the square. Lila stood at the center of it all, her chest rising and falling in quick bursts, her eyes lowered to the stones as if she could will them to cool the searing pain in her feet. Coins clinked as they hit the ground near her. A child, eyes wide, darted forward to place a single wildflower at her feet before scampering back to his mother. Voices overlapped in a jumble of praise, gossip and half-formed questions. Somewhere on the edge of the crowd, a woman was already swearing she'd never seen anything like it and never would again. The king, still cloaked in the plain garb of a traveler, waited. He had learned long ago that people revealed themselves most when they thought no one of consequence was watching. His guard, impatient, shifted beside him. "You'll draw notice if you linger," the guard murmured under his breath. "Not if I move now," the king replied, stepping forward. He crossed the square at an unhurried pace, slipping between onlookers who parted more for the weight of his presence than for the push of his body. When he reached her, Lila was kneeling, gathering the coins without looking up at those who had tossed them. He saw now the full extent of the burns, angry red welts, raw in places where skin had split under her own weight. She was careful in the way she rose, careful in the way she hid the wince, but not careful enough to hide it from someone trained to notice. "That was no ordinary dance," he said. His voice was pitched low, not the commanding tone of a ruler addressing a crowd, but the voice of one traveler speaking to another over a shared meal. Lila glanced up briefly, her gaze brushing over him without recognition. "It was only a dance," she said, her tone even. "No," the king said, shaking his head. "It was a storm and you were the eye of it." Something flickered in her expression, surprise perhaps or suspicion, but it was gone quickly. She bent again to retrieve the flower, holding it in her palm as if it were more valuable than the coins. "You speak like a poet," she said. "Most just say, 'Thank you,' or ask for another." "I'd ask for another," he replied, "if I thought it wouldn't cost you more than you can give today." His gaze dropped meaningfully to her feet. Her lips pressed together. "Pain is not the worst thing," she said softly. "Not dancing would be worse." The king studied her for a long moment. "And who taught you to think that way?" "No one," she answered. "Or perhaps everyone. When you are born with nothing, you learn early what is worth keeping." There was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet certainty that carried more weight than complaint. It was a kind of dignity he'd seen too rarely, even among nobles who claimed to live by honor. The guard shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "We should move on," he said quietly to the king, but Lila's eyes had already returned to the crowd as if she'd felt the restlessness. "Do you always dance here?" the king asked, ignoring the interruption. "When I can," she said. "When the market is busy enough to buy a little food. I dance to eat. I dance to live." She paused, then added with a wry, fleeting smile, "And sometimes it seems I dance to keep from breaking." The words lodged in him. He had been expecting deflection, perhaps even defensiveness, but not this unvarnished truth. "I don't know what happened before I saw you today," he said, "but I know I want to hear the whole of it." Her gaze sharpened, wary now. "Stories are not free. Nor are they always for sale," he countered. "But sometimes they are gifts given to those who will carry them well." She regarded him for a long moment before shaking her head. "I think I'll keep mine for now. A story told to the wrong ears can be more dangerous than silence." The king felt a slow smile touch his lips, not mockery but respect. "Then keep it," he said. "But know this, storms have a way of finding their way to my palace, and when they do, I listen." Her brows knit faintly at the odd phrasing, but before she could speak, a group of eager market children ran up, pulling at her skirt and asking her to teach them a step or two. She glanced between them and the stranger who had spoken to her with such peculiar weight, then gave the smallest of nods before turning to the children. The king stepped back, letting her attention shift away, but his mind was already fixed. He would not leave her to the cruelty he had sensed in the crowd, nor to the pain that had burned her feet. Whether she wished it or not, the storm she carried had just stepped into his life, and he would see where its winds led. The market's usual din, shouts of vendors hawking dates and figs, clattering of pots from the food stalls, bargaining that rose and fell like the tide, shifted into an uneasy hush as a ripple of movement passed through the crowd. Heads turned. Whispers darted between strangers like startled fish. From the far end of the square, men in dark, gleaming armor pushed through the press of bodies. Their steps were heavy, deliberate, and in the dry heat, the metal seemed to drink in the sun until it burned with a dull, dangerous glow. The crest on their breastplates caught the light, an unmistakable sigil of the royal guard, the golden hawk in mid-flight, talons extended. At first, some thought it a coincidence that they were passing through on their way to some other duty. But the way the guard's eyes scanned the space, sharp and unhurried, and the way the people instinctively stepped back told a different story. They were looking for someone. Lila, still surrounded by children tugging at her skirts and the lingering hum of those who had seen her dance, felt the air change. It was as if the market had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. The guard's leader, a tall man with a scar tracing the curve of his jaw, stopped only a few feet from her. "Kneel," he said, not to the crowd but to the plain-clothed man standing just behind him. And then it happened, as if a veil had been ripped away from their eyes. That traveler with the watchful gaze, the one who had spoken to Lila moments ago, shrugged off the plain brown cloak that had hidden him in their midst. Beneath it was not the garb of a merchant or wanderer, but the deep blue and gold silk of the royal household, embroidered so finely the threads seemed to shimmer with their own light. Gasps tore through the market. Someone stammered, "The king," before clapping a hand over their mouth as though afraid the words themselves were forbidden. Lila's breath caught. She felt suddenly exposed, as if all her burns, her poverty, her struggles were laid bare under the sun. The children at her side fell silent, retreating behind their mother's skirts. The rival performers, who only moments ago had worn smug satisfaction on their faces, now stared as if the ground beneath them might open at any moment. The king's voice, when it came, was nothing like the quiet travelers. It filled the square without effort, carrying the weight of authority that made spines straighten and eyes drop. "Bring her forward," he commanded, though he didn't need to, she was already standing before him. The scar-jawed guard stepped forward, offering his arm to steady her, but she refused with a small shake of her head. She would walk on her own, even if each step made fire bloom beneath her skin. When she stopped in front of him, the king's gaze swept from her face to her injured feet, lingering on the angry, glistening burns. His jaw tightened, and the gold hawk at his breast seemed to glare with him. "Who did this?" His words cut through the stillness, sharp as a blade. Lila swallowed. She knew the answer. The sly smile of the rival who had accidentally spilled the pot of oil still burned in her memory, but she also knew the cost of speaking aloud in front of the whole market. A king's wrath could destroy more than the guilty, it could scatter families, ruin livelihoods. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. The king's gaze swept over the crowd. "I will know," he said, the quiet edge in his voice somehow more dangerous than shouting. If she will not tell me, one of you will. The rival performers shifted uneasily. A murmur began in the crowd, small at first, then swelling. Someone muttered a name. Another person repeated it louder. Soon, the whispers fused into a single accusation that moved like a current, pointing toward the guilty. The woman who had spilled the oil stood rigid, her painted face drained of its usual brightness. She tried to step back, but the people nearest her moved away, isolating her like a stone in the center of a pond. The king's eyes found her. Step forward. She obeyed, but her head was bowed and her voice trembled when she spoke. It was, "Only an accident, Your Majesty. I meant no harm. No harm." The king's voice was measured, but beneath it was something cold, something dangerous. He gestured toward Lila's feet. "Is that what you call this?" The woman's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. No answer came. The king took a step closer and the air seemed to thicken. "In my market," he said, "every performer, every merchant, every child with a handful of flowers stands under my protection. You have broken that trust. And worse, you sought to crush beauty because you could not match it." A wave of shame moved through the crowd, though most of them had not lifted a hand against Lila. The rivals lowered their eyes, their earlier envy curling into something smaller, meaner, that even they did not want to hold. The king turned back to Lila, his voice softening, but only slightly. "You danced through fire," he said. "You turned cruelty into art, pain into strength. No crown could have demanded such grace. It is a thing given freely, or not at all." Lila felt something strange stir in her chest. Relief, yes, but also wariness. Kings could be generous one moment and ruthless the next. She had heard enough stories to know this. The king faced the guards. "See that she is treated. And see that her feet touch no stone until they are healed." As they moved to carry out his order, the king looked once more at the rival, who stood pale and still. "You will repay what you have taken," he said, "and more besides. For every step she could not take without pain, you will take 3 in service to those you have wronged." The rival's head dropped lower, and the crowd parted silently as the guards led her away. In the stillness that followed, the market seemed changed, not in its stalls or smells or sounds but in the way people looked at Lila. No longer just a street dancer, no longer just a girl from nowhere, she was the one the king had stopped for, the one he had defended. And though she did not yet know it, her steps from this day forward would carry her far beyond the cobblestones of the market square. The market was still buzzing from the moment the king's identity had been revealed, but the usual sounds of trade, the clink of coins, the calls of merchants, the bray of donkeys, were strangely muted. Instead, the air was heavy with the sharp taste of fear and the low murmur of gossip that rolled like smoke from one end of the square to the other. The rival who had spilled the oil stood frozen where the king's guards had left her. Her bangles, once a proud accompaniment to her own performances, now seemed to jangle with accusation instead of music. Beside her, 2 others, her closest companions, shifted uneasily, knowing they had laughed and whispered while Lila burned, their silence as cruel as the act itself. The king stood in the open, no canopy to shield him from the sun, his dark eyes taking in every face. His simple brown cloak, now discarded, lay folded in the hands of a guard, and the royal blue silk beneath it shimmered faintly in the heat. He did not seem bothered by the weight of the stairs, or by the tension that bound the market in place like a net. "Bring them forward," he said. The scar-jawed captain of the guard moved without hesitation, taking the rival's arm, not roughly, but firmly enough that she stumbled as she was brought before the king. Her 2 companions followed, their eyes darting to the crowd as though searching for allies and finding none. "You 3 sought to cripple her," the king said, his voice calm but carrying to every ear. "And not in battle nor in defense of your lives but out of jealousy. Do you deny it?" The rival shook her head weakly. It was only—" "A mistake?" the king interrupted, one brow arched. "Tell me, did your hands slip of their own will? Did the laughter I heard from those who stand beside you also happen by accident?" The woman's mouth snapped shut. She knew denial was useless now, the market had already condemned her in whispers. The king's gaze swept over the 3 of them, cold and steady. "In this market there is room for many voices, many hands, many dancers. But there is no room for cruelty that seeks to destroy what it cannot match." A ripple passed through the crowd, approval, relief, perhaps a bit of satisfaction. These performers had long been known for their sharp tongues and sharper eyes, quick to tear down those who rose too brightly. "You will repay what you have taken," the king continued. "For each step this girl could not take without pain, you will take 10 in service to those you have wronged in this market." You will scrub the stones, carry the loads, and serve food to the poorest among you. And you will do it in silence, without coin, until the market judge declares your debt paid." The rival flinched but said nothing. The king turned to his guards. "See it done." They moved to escort the three away, their anklets and bangles clinking not with grace but with the flat sound of defeat. The crowd parted, eyes following them until they were out of sight. Then the king's attention returned to Lila. She was still standing barefoot on the hot cobblestones, the burns on her feet angry and raw, but she had not once looked away from him. That unflinching gaze, he thought, was rarer than any talent. He stepped closer, speaking low enough for only those nearby to hear. "You stood in the fire and did not fall. That is not something I can ignore." Lila opened her mouth, uncertain whether to thank him or tell him she had only danced because falling would have been worse, because falling would have meant surrendering to them. But before she could answer, the king gestured to the captain of the guard. "Bring a physician," he ordered. "See that her injuries are treated before the sun sets. She will not take another step on these stones until she has healed." The captain bowed and signaled to a younger guard, who hurried off through the crowd. The king faced Lila again. "I have seen many dances in my court," he said, "but none born from such defiance and grace. I would have you perform at the palace." Lila blinked. "At the palace, your majesty?" "Yes," he said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "There are dancers who spend years vying for such an invitation. You have earned it in a single afternoon." Her heart thudded in her chest. She thought of her mother, who had once told her that beauty and talent could open doors, but only if one dared to walk through them. She thought of the oil spilling over her skin, the mocking laughter, the unbearable heat, and how she had turned all of it into movement, into something no one could look away from. The king's voice softened slightly. "You will come as a court dancer, not a beggar from the street. The palace will clothe you, feed you, and pay you in coin and honor. And your place will be protected." For the first time since the oil had touched her skin, Lila felt her throat tighten. Not with fear but with something dangerously close to relief. She bowed her head. "I will come, Majesty." A stir of excitement moved through the market. Those who had once tossed her a few coins for a morning's dance now whispered about the girl who would stand before the king's throne. Children tugged at their mothers, pointing at her with wide eyes, and merchants nodded as though they had known she was destined for greater things. The guard returned with a physician, a thin man with quick eyes and hands stained faintly with herbal oils. He crouched beside Lila, examining her feet with a practiced touch. "The burns are deep," he murmured, "but not beyond healing. We will cleanse them and keep her off them for a week." The king nodded. "See to it. She will ride with my retinue when we return to the palace." As the physician began his work, cool salve meeting the angry heat of her skin, Lila let out a slow breath. Around her, the market was slowly returning to life, the vendors calling out again, the clatter of coins returning, though now it all seemed different, as though a shadow had lifted. The rivals would serve their punishment under the eyes of those they had once sought to impress. The market, she sensed, would remember this day for years. And she was no longer just Lila of the cobblestones. By the time the king mounted his horse and gestured for her to be brought along in a cushioned carriage, the whispers had already taken root. Some said the king had chosen her for her beauty, others for her defiance, others still for the way her dance had seemed to draw the very air into its rhythm. But in Lila's heart, she knew the truth. She had not been chosen because she had been flawless, but because she had danced when it would have been easier to fall. The palace gates awaited. And with them, a future she had never dared to imagine. The journey to the palace took the better part of a day, and though the royal carriage rocked gently over the roads, Lila could not rest. She sat near the open side, the cool evening air touching her face, watching the farmlands pass in waves of gold and green. Every so often, she glanced down at her feet, now wrapped in clean bandages and resting on a soft cushion. The salve had dulled the pain, but every step the carriage took still sent a faint pulse through her skin, a reminder that the dance of fire had been carved into her by heat and willpower. She had never been inside the palace walls, though she'd seen them from afar, pale stone rising above the rooftops of the capital like the sides of a mountain. As the caravan crested the final hill, the view unfolded before her, gleaming white battlements bathed in the orange light of sunset, banners in the royal colors rippling in the wind, and a cluster of towers reaching skyward as though in challenge to the clouds. The king rode at the head of the procession, still in the same blue silk tunic he had worn in the market, though now his cloak was a deep crimson lined with fur. When the caravan passed through the great gates, the guards bowed low, their armor gleaming. The sound of hooves and wheels echoed against the high walls until they entered the main courtyard, where torchlight already burned in preparation for the night. A steward in a dark green robe approached the carriage, bowing slightly to Lila before offering a hand to help her down. She hesitated, her feet throbbed even at the thought, but two maidservants quickly placed a small cushioned stool at the carriage step, allowing her to descend without strain. The steward gave a faint approving nod, then led her inside through corridors that seemed impossibly tall, lined with polished columns and inlaid floors that caught the flicker of torchlight. She was shown to a chamber that felt larger than the entire room she had shared with her mother back in the market quarter. The bed was covered in embroidered silks, the table set with fresh fruit and steaming tea, and in the corner stood a tall polished mirror. Her reflection startled her. The dust of the market was gone, her hair brushed smooth, and the fine robe they had given her shimmered when she moved. That night, sleep came only in fragments. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the market again, the spill of oil, the shock of heat, the faces staring at her in disbelief as she kept dancing. But now the memory was overlaid with something else. The king's eyes watching her with a mix of curiosity and respect, and the sound of his voice inviting her to the palace. By morning word had spread through the court. Servants whispered in the halls, and even some of the courtiers who passed her on the way to the great hall cast sidelong glances, their expressions a blend of intrigue and skepticism. She was no trained court dancer after all, no one who had studied the prescribed movements under master tutors for years. She was an outsider. The king, however, seemed unmoved by such murmurs. That afternoon he summoned her to the practice chamber where musicians awaited with their instruments, drums, lutes, and a long, low flute whose tone could stretch like smoke. "Tomorrow night," he said simply, "you will dance for the court. The music will be yours to choose, but I want the same fire I saw in the market. Do not hide it to please anyone here." Lila bowed her head, though inside her heart pounded. This was no crowded street where she could vanish into the flow of people if she failed. The court was a stage of eyes and judgment, and a single misstep could turn admiration into scorn. She spent the rest of the day working with the musicians. At first, her movements felt stiff under the vaulted ceiling, her feet cautious on the smooth marble, her arms unsure without the press and chaos of the market. But as the hours passed, she began to hear it again, that same rhythm that had carried her through the pain, the one that had turned each step into defiance. When the moment came, it would be that rhythm she would summon. The next evening the palace was alive with light. Lanterns glowed in the gardens, their colors reflecting in the marble pools. The great hall was filled with courtiers in silks and jewels, their voices weaving into a low, constant murmur as they awaited the king's entrance. On the dais, the royal seat stood empty, but two golden braziers flanked it, their flames steady. Lila stood just beyond the side doors, her bandages replaced with thin soft slippers dyed a deep crimson. She had chosen a costume of layered fabrics in shades of red and gold that would flare and twist with her movement, echoing the fire she was about to call upon. Her hands were bare, the skin healed but still marked faintly where the oil had splashed. She had decided not to hide those marks, they were part of the story she would tell tonight. The herald's voice rang out, announcing the king. The courtiers rose as he entered, his cloak sweeping the floor, and when he sat, the murmurs quieted. Then the herald spoke again, presenting Lila, the king's chosen dancer. The musicians began, the deep roll of the drums like distant thunder. Lila stepped forward, her first movements slow, deliberate, the rhythm of her breath matching the beat. She let the court see her hesitate, let them think for a moment that she might falter. Then she let the memory of the oil return, let the heat curl through her like a serpent, and her pace quickened. Her arms cut through the air, her feet struck the marble with sharp precision, each movement both beautiful and edged. The lutes joined the drums, their strings weaving quick silver threads through the heavy beat, and Lila spun, the fabric of her costume flaring like flames leaping in a gust. Her eyes never left the space just above the king's head, never challenging him directly but never bowing either. And as she moved, she felt the same shift she had in the market, the world narrowing until there was nothing but the music, her body, and the fire she carried inside. The court was silent not because they disapproved but because they were caught. They had expected grace, they had not expected defiance to be so beautiful. The drums grew louder, matching the pounding in her chest. She turned the final sequence into a fierce series of steps that landed her in a low bow, her arms spread wide, the gold fabric pooling like molten light. The music stopped. For a breath there was nothing. Then applause broke like a wave. The king did not smile broadly, he was not a man given to such displays, but there was a glint in his eyes as he rose. "Remember this night," he said to the court, "for you have seen not just a dance but a triumph over cruelty. This is the dance of fire, born from pain but shaped into art. Let it be told that courage can be as beautiful as grace." The courtiers murmured their approval and the musicians bowed their heads. From that night forward, Lila was no longer simply a dancer from the market. She became a symbol whispered about in the halls, her story told to those who needed to remember that strength could rise from the cruelest blows. Years later, the tale was still told, of the girl who had danced barefoot in the market, who had turned agony into music, and who had caught the king's eye not with her beauty